Hey everybody, Larry Lawton here. I got a good video for you today. I got a react video on something that happened years ago, and it's decision in the Navy. People ask me a lot of times about my Coast Guard days, so I wanted to jump on this. This is going to be really cool. It's about a sub that went down and what they have to do. I didn't see it. I read the synopsis, so you're going to see it with me. Before I get started, check us out on all our programs. Please like, subscribe, pass this on. It helps. People don't understand it. It does help. We get banned for a lot of reasons, but like I said, please like, subscribe, hit those buttons, and that'll help a lot. So let's get into this video. I love this stuff because you guys know I'm a retired Coast Guardman. Yes, I was a bosun mate, which means I was a deck guy on a ship. They used to call us deck apes, the deck apes are the guys that, used to do the roughneck stuff. That was me. So let's check this video out. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Submarines were first developed, they had an awful reputation, and for good reason. There had been many accidents and many sailors whose graves were on the bottom of the ocean. So much so that the submarine service had earned the nickname the Coffin Service. In 1939,
whenever I see this, I think about it because my two nephews served on submarines. One on a Trident class submarine, and he was in for about 4 or 6 years, maybe even, and the other one was in for about 8 years. He ended up becoming a first class, and he was on like attack subs, and that they both did tech stuff.
One of the worst of these incidents would add to this reputation. This is that horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised.
This is kind of exciting. I love this channel too. Scary, interesting. Shout out to them, man. They always come up with some good stuff. This is really kind of gives you the goosebumps.
Between the end of World War I and the first shots of World War II, navies around the world were tirelessly developing and testing submarine technology. To that point, fighting a war under the sea was done by primitive means, but the early 1920s marked a significant leap forward in submarine capabilities. Countries raced one another to build and deploy more advanced submarines capable of diving.
Now you got to remember, guys, this is in the 1920s. Listen, I'm so claustrophobic now. Man, I keep thinking about that, man. I'd be freaking out for real.
Deeper, faster, and for longer than ever before. Like other countries, the United States invested heavily in bolstering its navy with top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art subs, and in 1938, it launched its class of Sargo ships, which were equipped with a new lead-acid battery that was resistant to battle damage.
These are underground, underwater with batteries. Remember, this is all battery power.
One of these was known as the USS Squalus, which was one of the first in its class and was capable of reaching depths of up to 250 feet. Surface
250 feet, that was the depth, and going 20 knots. That's pretty fast, actually, underwater. And, you really don't know where you're going. Back then, they didn't have the charts of the seas like they really did. You didn't know if there were continental shelves and how they had stuff. Man, these guys were crazy.
Speeds of up to 20 knots and distances of 11,000 miles on a single tank of fuel. Even by the growing standards of submarine technology, the Squalus and its sister ship, the USS Sculpin, were advanced beyond their years. They had been designed in the lead-up to World War II for the task of cutting off Japanese trade and could escape enemy planes by fully submerging in less than a minute while operating at full speed, which was something that no other sub could do. Once the Squalus was...
That is just cool to think about, the sub going down like that. Just think of that. Man, this is so cool.
Completed, the Navy began a battery of test dives to ensure that its design was safe and its parts were capable of withstanding all that was expected of it. And this testing process was something that countries took incredibly seriously because a total of 825 men from 18 subs across multiple countries have been killed.
Look at the amount of men dead. This is crazy, and to think they're in this stuff. It is.
Sub accidents between 1921 and 1938.
825 people in 1928 to 38, not even 10 years, right?
Submarining, as a result, had earned the moniker the Coffin Service by the media and public. But the Sargo class of ships aimed to undo that reputation. And thankfully, by then, in its test runs, the Squalus was performing its functions and purpose to near perfection. On the morning of May 23, 1939, the Squalus left the mouth of the Piscataqua River for another test dive with a crew that included 53 officers and sailors. Also along for the ride were 2 civilian Navy.
53 officers and sailors and 2 civilians. That's not a lot of people on a ship. I mean, I was on a ship in the Coast Guard, we had 188 guys. So that was a little bit different.
Engineers and a representative from General Motors who had designed the batteries. Then, under the command of Rear Admiral Oliver F. Naquin, the sub was put on a course toward the coast of New Hampshire, just a few miles from the Isle of Shoals.
Now listen, the coast of New Hampshire, this is called the North Atlantic. This gets real rough, people. Believe me, I know about the oceans. This gets real rough. Like, I was in the Pacific on the Bering Sea, which is mega rough on the Pacific coast, and this is the Atlantic. This is the North Atlantic.
The test for the day would include underwater maneuvers and several dives and resurfaces, and it would be as routine a test as the ship had faced. Around 9 a.m., the horn sounded throughout the sub, indicating a pending dive command from the captain. At this point, the sub was on the surface and traveling at 16 knots, and the admiral stood behind a large board in the control room filled with lights that would illuminate red or green depending on the status of different parts and pieces of the ship. The dive process relied heavily on the engine room crewmen, and at the sound of the horn, they would need to cut the diesel-powered engines quickly and then close the air vents before the ship submerged. Right before he gave the official dive order, the admiral ensured the entire panel was lit up green, and then when everything appeared as it should, he gave the final order, and the Squalus dipped beneath the surface. When it did, though, a fluttering of air pressure occurred in his ears just before the intercom blared with a sailor shouting to take the ship back up to the surface. Despite what the board indicated, one of the vents was still wide open and seawater was rushing into the engine rooms. Admiral Oliver just stared in disbelief. What was being reported by his crew was impossible based on what he was looking at. But either way, he then immediately ordered that the ballast tanks be blown to get the Squalus to the surface as quickly as possible. Horrifyingly though, the sub took on water faster than it could surface, and after an initial rise, the Squalus slowed to a stop. Meanwhile, in the engine room, the crew was fighting a torrent of water, just trying to survive as the ship tilted downward at a 45-degree angle and then began a rapid descent to the sea floor. It was then that Oliver was faced with a decision no officer ever wants to make. He knew that the survival of anyone on the ship relied on the closure of the watertight doors between the control room and the engine room compartments. Doing this, however, would trap those who were still inside while they flooded completely. But at the same time, not locking off the compartments would ensure that everyone on board would die.
Wow.
Oliver was no.
Think of this decision this guy's got to make. Think of it. He's either cut off and kill all these people or kill the whole ship. Obviously, you know, you're going to make that decision for the most part. By the most you're going to save, and hopefully it's a reaction. And that's why the military trains so much.
Known as a strict, no-nonsense discipline leader, and his tact had a very good reason behind it. In submarines, every single decision and action anyone on board can make can result in disaster. There was just no room for error, and at times like that, unfortunately, there was no room for humanity. Oliver then gave the order to seal off the control room compartment with the men inside.
Hear what it said? There's no room for humanity. That's amazing, man. Wow.
As the man responsible for this order, a man named Lloyd Menace, started to put all his weight into closing the 200-pound door, he heard the screams of men begging him to wait, but there was no time. Water was already rushing toward the bulkhead behind them, so the compartment door had to be sealed immediately. As he pulled the door closed, several of those battling the water made it through to safety before it slammed shut. He then cranked its wheel and ensured it was watertight, ultimately sealing the fate of those left in the sub's 4 flooded compartments, including Sherman Shirley, who was Lloyd's best friend.
Oh, man, he had to do that with his best friend. This has got to be ripping your heart out, man. This is wild.
Tragically, Sherman's wedding date was supposed to be the following Sunday, and Lloyd was supposed to be his best man.
And his wedding was a week later, and the other guy that closed the door was the one as the best man. Oh my God! You want to talk about ripping your? Wow! This is what makes this crazy.
Man. Among the others were 17 crewmen who tried to seal themselves in the torpedo room and 9 in the engine room and rear battery rooms. One man even climbed a hatch ladder and tried to push open the door to the ocean outside, but the sea pressure was too strong in the door to push it. The Squalus then continued to fall toward the bottom as the batteries in the flood compartments were fried by the water. And as if the uncontrolled descent wasn't terrifying enough, the lights flickered before going out completely, plunging the crew into complete darkness. This then led to a new problem. The chief electrician, Lawrence Gaynor, then grabbed a flashlight and climbed into the crawl space where the batteries were stored. Since the batteries lined the entire length of the ship's keel, many of them were already submerged, but the ones that weren't were wet and at risk of catching on fire. Lawrence also noticed that they were losing voltage fast, causing them to smolder, and if the heat reached the battery cell, there would be an explosion that would crack the hull wide open. Even by the time he reached the batteries, they were already smoking and well on their way to heating past the point of no return. He then flipped one of the disconnect switches, and the flash of...
Just think of who knew that batteries would explode like that underwater, or if they got like heat and they start smoldering. I didn't know that. I mean, this is old batteries that I'm not saying I remember. This is 1939, obviously. My mother was born. She was around.
of light completely blinded him. So next, without his sight, he felt around the other remaining battery and managed to find the second switch to stop it from exploding, narrowly averting a much more serious incident.
Now that guy is a hero off jump. Lawrence Gaynor. Of course, his name's spelled as mine. Larry Lawrence, Lawrence. Anyway, he's the chief electrician. That dude's the one who really stopped that from exploding. People don't know. That's amazing.
Back in the control room, they had no idea how far they were going to fall, and the sub was only rated for a maximum depth of 250 feet or 76 meters. If the ocean floor was much further than that, there was a possibility the sub would implode before touching down.
That's crazy. Now, if that goes beyond its what they call the strength of the hull, it would implode. It would literally like air coming out, like as if you were using a vacuum machine. Take the air right out.
All they could do was wait in the silence and darkness as the sub groaned its way deeper and deeper into the ocean. Then, fortunately, and with a heavy thud, the Squalus impacted the bottom of the Atlantic at a depth of 240 feet or 73 meters. When it did, it came to a rest, sticking straight up, completely perpendicular to the surface.
Well, see, it says max depth at 250, and it stopped at 240. Listen, it could have been 300. They didn't know. They learned that later. They're telling what they would trust it at. Now they're at 240.
Surface. The 33 survivors were then trapped in the air pocket they had created by sealing off the rest of the sub. However, despite what should have been chaos, they didn't even need a moment to take in the reality of their situation. Their training kicked in, and being trapped at the bottom of the ocean was a scenario they simulated often, so each of them knew their roles and began to execute. The first task was for the sub to signal its location by releasing a buoy that was attached to a cable. The buoy would not only help rescuers spot them, but it would also provide communication between the sub and the surface through the cable. Additionally, the Squalus was able to shoot off flares and smoke bombs to grab the attention of anyone on the surface.
That's pretty wild back then in those days that they had thought about that, how to release a thing and have communications in a balloon. That just goes to show who thinks up this stuff. This is wild, man. I'm loving this stuff. This is crazy, man. I'm getting a little nervous because I'm so claustrophobic now. I would go crazy with this. I really would.
As they went through these procedures, the men couldn't help but wonder if anyone in the other compartments ended up surviving. So one of them grabbed a hammer and began tapping on the air lines that ran to the back of the hull. If anyone was alive, they'd respond by doing the same. So after several hammer taps from the control room, they held their breath so they could hear even the faintest tap in return, but there was no reply. It was a reality they didn't want to face, but it was confirmed that nearly half of them had died. Back in the control room, Oliver...
Half of them already died. That's eerie shit, man. That is eerie stuff, that they actually died like that. That's just blowing me away right now.
Then ordered some of the men to grab the emergency supplies, which included food, flashlights, oxygen stores, carbon dioxide absorbent, blankets, and coats. He knew they'd probably been for a wait and without power, so it was about to get very cold very quickly. With that being handled, Oliver turned his attention to the next threat to survival, which was their air supply. Taking into consideration the number of survivors, he estimated there was probably 48 hours worth of air before everyone died of suffocation.
Wow, 48 hours of air. I mean, how are they figuring all this stuff out? These people are smart.
Seems like plenty of time to be rescued and back on dry land in New Hampshire, but the prudent course of action was to conserve everything that could possibly stretch that time. Oliver then split the men into two groups, placing 10 of the healthiest and youngest in the colder torpedo room and keeping the 23 remaining in the warmer control room. One of the men then started handing out devices called Momsen lungs, which are a breathing apparatus that can be used from a reasonable depth to swim to the surface.
I know they're going to say, I don't know what they're going to say, I really don't, but I think they're going to say something to the fact of 240 feet you couldn't get up. I don't know, man. I'm giving it a whirl.
The crew of the Squalus was 40 feet or 12 meters deeper than the Momsen lungs were rated for, and it was uncertain if they'd even work at that depth. And even if they did work, no one knew if they'd have enough air to reach the surface, so these would have to be used as an absolute last resort. Then, once those were handed out, Oliver instructed the men to nap as much as they were able to prevent panic breathing. Before long, the temperature in the sub was 35 Fahrenheit or 2 Celsius, and the inner hull was beginning to form a layer of ice on it. Some of the men were able to fall asleep, but others weren't.
Wow. Just think, you're in the Navy and they tell you to go fall asleep so you can conserve oxygen. You know it's down to the end, man. You gotta be freaking.
Stay calm, some of them took to whistling a tune. They would just have to wait until rescue arrived or the air ran out, whichever came first. When the Squalus failed to return to the shipyard when expected, its sister ship, the Sculpin, was preparing to leave New Hampshire for Panama. But upon hearing that the Squalus was in trouble, the Sculpin left port and raced to the coordinates the Navy gave them. When they reached them, though, the Sculpin's captain, Warren Wilkins, was puzzled not to see the emergency buoy anywhere. This was because, somewhere in the rush to get the search for the Squalus underway, the coordinates were written down incorrectly, and the Sculpin was in the wrong area. If not for one of the ship's lookouts who spotted a flare further out, the Squalus may have never been found.
That's amazing. They gave him wrong coordinates. Wow. Somebody had to get their head cut off for that. I mean, listen, I did a lot of rescues on the ocean. When you're out in the middle, like I remember having to go out 60, 50, 60, 70 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico to go rescue somebody. Listen to me, if you're off by a few degrees with your coordinates, you're going to miss that person by miles, or that boat by miles and miles, and you won't see them. So being right on with your coordinates and understanding how to use those coordinates is so important. Obviously, somebody messed up.
Luckily, that wasn't the case, and Warren then handed down orders to head in that direction, and as they drew close, they spotted the buoy and pulled up alongside it. Below the
Talk about lucky and good lookout. It's very hard to spot things on the water. They did catch that flare, so the people who even came up with these rescue the buoys and everything else, they're the smart people, really. The people who plan that. Pretty cool.
ocean in the Squalus, the crew actually heard the sound of a sub-engine above them, and morale inside skyrocketed just knowing that help had found them. Moments later, Oliver's voice was heard inside the Sculpin. He said hello, and Warren replied in kind, but then a second later, the phone went dead. As the two captains were greeting one another, an ocean swell snapped the buoy cable, and the Sculpin quickly lost track of the location of the Squalus.
Oh, wow.
And for hours afterward, the Sculpin had to actually drag a hook along the bottom of the ocean, hoping to run into the sub. They would eventually find it again, but this cost the rescue for precious time. The Sculpin then connected a new buoy and waited for reinforcements from other ships. Then, instead of using a direct communication, they used Morse code to communicate with one another, and the Squalus communicated the number of survivors in the sub. The Sculpin then tapped that code for the letters SRC. Oliver immediately knew what that meant, and he expected that he'd hear it at some point. SRC stood for Submarine Rescue Chamber, and there was only one available anywhere on the East Coast. In a stroke of good luck, it just so happened to be in Connecticut at the time of the sub sinking, and a ship called the Falcon was already heading in the direction of the Squalus with it. This 9-ton submarine rescue chamber resembles an upside-down wine glass.
This is so cool. It is so amazing that they're figuring this out. That back in 1939, they're that quick to react. I mean, this is something that should be down in history, and I know why you wanted me to do it. Because it's first of all, it's blowing me away. I would be I don't know if I would have had to be strapped down with straps right now, because I once was in an MRI machine, and I told the doc I will break this whole machine. I can't even get in an open MRI machine. In fact, they have to actually give me they have to knock me out. They have to put me under, because I can't do it. It's just not happening.
And as this name suggests, it could transport survivors from disabled submarines back to the surface. Inside, the chamber is controlled by 2 crewmen who guide it down and connect its bottom to one of the submarine hatches using a watertight rubber gasket. And from there, the hatch doors for both ships are opened, and survivors simply climb the ladder into the chamber, which takes them to the surface. At the time, however, this wasn't a tried and true method of rescuing crewmen from subs. The SRC had only ever been used in testing, so this would be the very first true test of its function.
Wow, you got the first sub to be tested. This is crazy.
Around 4:30 the next morning, the Falcon arrived over the Squalus, and not a moment too soon. As survivors in the sub were approaching the 24-hour mark, Oliver began rationing oxygen. Periodically, he'd order the release of stored emergency oxygen and let it run for a few moments before shutting it back down. By doing this, he hoped to stretch the supply as far as it could, but the impact on the survivors was also obvious. As the Falcon prepared to launch the SRC, the 33 survivors were suffering from headaches and nausea, which are some of the earliest signs of hyperthermia.
Yes, hypothermia, everything else that's going to set in, oxygen narcosis.
Capnia or carbon dioxide poisoning. If this went on long enough, it could end up being fatal. Eventually, a hypercapnia sufferer would simply drift into unconsciousness and not wake up again. Unfortunately, putting himself and his men on the brink of hypercapnia was what Oliver knew was going to keep them all alive as long.
Wow, this captain is really like, he's not only smart, but he's playing God. Think about that. You know, if somebody starts going out, do you keep it going? Do you, I don't know, it's just crazy.
As possible. By then as well, the other major concern of the sub was hypothermia. Since some of the men had escaped the flooding compartments before they were sealed, they remained soaked through and in temperatures close to freezing. On the surface, the Falcon lowered the SRC into the water and the capsule began its descent along with a support diver. Part of the procedure for safely securing the SRC to a sub was attaching a cable from the rescue chamber to the hatch door, and as simple as it may sound, it was one of the more dangerous jobs for divers. In the 1930s, the Navy Experimental Diving had just begun testing different mixes of helium and oxygen that divers could breathe beyond 100 feet or 33 meters. These were supposed to lessen the onset of nitrogen narcosis. If you've watched the many cave diving videos on the channel, you're probably all too familiar with this concept. But when this rescue was taking place, much of this was barely in its infancy.
See, oxygen narcosis I just mentioned, it's you actually feel like you're getting drunk. That's the feeling, and you hit that at a certain depth. Everybody's a little bit different. I remember going down. I was about 160 feet, and I maybe 180 feet, and I was starting to hit it. Some people hit it earlier. Some people hit it a little later. It does. You will hit it. It's when the oxygen gets thin in your blood, and before you know it, you are now literally lightheaded, like you're drunk.
For those who aren't familiar, as a diver descends when breathing regular air, the increasing water pressure causes nitrogen to become narcotic. Divers can then become disoriented and euphoric while losing motor skills and problem-solving abilities.
Yeah, that's me, losing motor skills and problem-solving abilities. That's what happens to everybody, though.
That far underwater is obviously the last place you want to experience this, but by breathing a gas with a lower concentration of nitrogen at depths beyond 100 feet, it can prevent or greatly reduce the impact of narcosis on a diver. Unfortunately, for the divers assisting in the Squalus rescue, these gas mixes weren't used universally, so the longest they could stay at a depth like 240 feet was just 20 minutes. Either way, the diver then descended to the head of the SRC and began to suffer from narcosis symptoms before he reached the sub. This caused him to collide hard with the Squalus. Despite this, he managed to get his bearings and successfully attach the cable. Behind him, the SRC was on its slow descent, and once it reached the vicinity of the sub, the two men controlling it inside maneuvered the chamber and settled it over the hatch. Once it was sealed tightly, the water was pumped out, and then when it was clear, the men inside the sub began turning the wheel on the hatch door. As it popped open, water poured in for a second, but thankfully that was just some of the residual from the connection point. Then, a second later, they saw the man inside the SRC standing there holding blankets and coffee. These supplies were much needed for the men who were wet and cold, and more importantly, finally, this seems like clear indication that they would be able to leave the bottom of the ocean alive.
This is crazy. Now they see the people.
Once the SRC was attached and communication was established, the men began to plan a way to get everyone to the surface safely. There was only enough room for 8 crewmen at one time, so Oliver split the men into groups based on their condition. The ones who were approaching severe hypothermia would go first, and the ones in the best condition would go last. Once that was clear, the hatch was unsealed and the SRC began returning to the surface. Now, despite being so close to safety, the period between the SRC departing and returning felt excruciatingly long, and the rationing of air didn't make the wait any more bearable. The men would reach a point where their heads were pounding so hard from hypercapnia, they desperately waited for Oliver to switch the oxygen stores back on. In addition, one round trip for the SRC took about 3.5 hours. 1 hour to descend, about an hour to attach and load the chamber, and then another hour and a half to the surface. By then as well, since the
3 hours. Wow. That's each lift, and they got 30-some guys. So now, well, they had how many? I think 6. It could take 8 at a time and had 4 trips. Did they have maybe, I don't know, 29, 30, something like that, but that's how many trips they got to make. They got to make 4 trips. This is wild.
Survivors had been trapped for more than 24 hours, there was still a chance that the sub could run out of air before everyone was safe. After 3 successful trips, only 10 remained in the final group, one of which was Admiral Oliver.
You would think I don't know what's going to happen here, but you would think they're going to bring down some air tanks or something if they got these guys, even if it's an hour, 2 hours, or whatever. It's the last group.
When the time came, he and the others boarded the SRC, and once the hatches were secured, the chamber lifted off the Squalus and began a final trip to the surface. On ascent, however, one of these stabilizing cables jammed, causing the chamber to stop abruptly around the 150-foot mark.
Get out of
At the
here.
same time,
How many shits can these guys go through? This is crazy. You're on this ship. You're about to get rescued. Now you're at 115. The cable snaps. Give me a break. You got to be saying, listen, if there's a God up there, bro, what did I do, man? Am I that bad? Wow.
this caused the cable that went from the winch on the Falcon to the top of the chamber to become frayed, and during this, all but 2 of these 7 strands that were the lifelines to the crew had snapped. One of the divers then had to re-enter the water and descend to assess the situation, and it was realized that the stabilizing cable would need to be cut for the chamber to ascend. The problem was that this cable was crucial for both guiding the chamber to and from the sub, but also keeping it from swinging and spinning in the ocean.
Oh my god.
However, without any other options, this cable was then cut and the chamber began to spin uncontrollably. In order to reset and figure out what to do next, operators then lowered the SRC back down and set it on the ocean floor.
Oh!
This meant that the last few survivors had been less than 200 feet from safety, and once again, they were stuck on the bottom of the Atlantic.
Think of that, guys. They went spinning. Can you imagine that ride they're on? You think you're going to die. You got to be puking it up in there or whatever. And then they drop you back down to the bottom to stop the spinning to figure out how to get you up there. This is crazy.
On the Falcon, there were concerns that the final cable might be at risk of snapping too, so after a brief discussion, rescuers decided not to use the winch and instead they pulled the bell up the full 240 feet by hand. This was an excruciating process that took 4 hours, but it worked, and about 40 hours after plunging to the bottom of the ocean, the surviving crew of the Squalus was saved. Many of them would require medical attention, and some even stayed in the hospital for some time, but all of them survived the ordeal. Once the dust from the rescue had settled, the next order of business for the Navy was to figure out how to salvage the Squalus. It was a brand new, very expensive sub that was at a so the Navy...
You see that? The Navy still want to save money. They got them out, though, man. I give them a lot of credit. That's got to be... I could not go on a sub. I'm telling you guys, maybe when I was younger, maybe your age out there, maybe I could have. But I could tell you right now, guys, I could no way have been on a sub after I got out of prison. I don't know if it was prison or the military, but probably prison that got me claustrophobic and being in a hole all that time.
We didn't want to leave it there, but at the same time, a salvage operation like it had never been attempted. However, over the course of 4 months, the Navy would work almost around the clock to raise the sub in a series of trial and error attempts. The first idea was to attach deflated pontoons together with loose chains. Divers would then slip the chains underneath the Squalus before inflating the pontoons. On the first try, though, once the pontoons were filled with air, the Squalus began an uncontrolled descent, and when it broke the surface of the ocean with slightly more speed than expected, it shot loose of the chains and began a second descent all the way back to the ocean floor.
Oh.
In the end, it took 5 different attempts using various methods of attaching those pontoons before the sub could be raised and towed back to the Navy shipyard. When it was secured
all those
there,
bodies.
Water was drained from the flooded compartments, and 25 of 26 bodies were recovered. During one of these salvage attempts, one of the hatches shot open, and one body drifted out of the sub and into the depths, and it was never recovered.
Oh, wow.
Once the Squalus was finally examined, to the relief of the sub's captain and crew, the issue was a mechanical malfunction instead of a human error. This malfunction then prevented some of the vents from closing properly, which was not indicated by the control board. Oliver was then commended for his outstanding leadership, bravery, and the handling of the disaster, but he gave the credit to the crewmen under his command. In a report he wrote for the Navy, Oliver explained that he had witnessed a true example of camaraderie and brotherly love, and each of the crewmen believed himself accountable for the life of the man next to him. And together, they made it through by sharing blankets and huddling into groups to maintain body heat. Those who were better off sacrificed for those in much worse shape, and even Oliver gave up his coat to one of the hypothermic crewmen. Oliver also devoted space in his report to the selfless act performed by the electrician Lawrence. In the captain's mind, Lawrence's quick thinking in disabling the remaining batteries to prevent the explosion was what truly saved them. And this came at a...
Did I say that or what? Man, that was pretty good that he saved them. That was pretty good call on my part.
Cost for Lawrence too. When he disabled the first battery, it completed a circuit that sent literal lightning bolts around the hull so bright that he'd live the rest of his life with vision issues. Once all of the investigations were finished, although the damage to the Squalus was extensive, it would ultimately be salvageable. After its repairs, it was recommissioned as the USS Sailfish, and 3 of the Squalus survivors even
The Sailfish, I think that's in Hawaii now. I think that's a museum.
came back to serve as part of the crew. Among the others, 4 died in action during World War II, and Admiral Oliver never commanded another submarine again. He instead opted to become an engineering officer on the USS California, which happened to be a target during Pearl Harbor, but fortunately, he was ashore when the attack began and survived. 2 years later, the Sculpin was sunk by a Japanese destroyer, and the Sailfish returned the favor by sinking that destroyer. It then served admirably during World War II and was eventually decommissioned shortly after. And more than 80 years later, the rescue and recovery of the Squalus and his crew is still one of the Navy's most challenging operations ever. To this day, the incredible effort of Oliver and the crew is part of the Navy's official handbook on submarine rescue. If you made it this far, thanks so much.
That is pretty wild, huh? I love that. That's scary. That stuff is really cool what they do here with this whole entire channel. I mean, and you know, you don't know what you're gonna get. I think that's so scary. I mean, I don't know what's worse. Like, you know, when I was in prison in the whole fighting for my life, I didn't think of it. You know, you could have died and just say, "Hey, you did whatever," but you survive it. You do it. You know, you don't think about it. Those guys were in a submarine, freezing. Some of them can't breathe. You talk about, listen, there was something to say for being in shape. And that helps a lot because obviously your lungs, everything else. In fact, it even helps if you're skinny in shape. So all you young kids out there are skinny. Don't be wanting to be big and muscular. You know, this can hurt you in the long run. But anyway, guys, I hope you like that one. Check it out. Keep sending what those requests are. I love doing these kind of things, and we will catch you in the rebound. Take care, everybody. Please stay safe. See you next time.